Before we dive in, I'd like to ask a small favor. I'm pouring all my energy into reaching my goal of 1,000 subscribers, which means the world to me. Please, I'm asking you to hit that subscribe button. It's just a single click, but it gives me tremendous motivation to keep creating more videos. Thank you so much.
In the quiet, tree-lined neighborhoods of Savannah, Georgia, the humid morning air carried the scent of blooming magnolias and damp earth. Catherine Hughes slipped her plastic employee ID badge into her coat pocket before she even cleared the heavy glass doors of the historic downtown consulting firm where she had worked for the past 3 years. Hiding it felt like a desperate attempt to delay a truth she wasn't ready to face. No one accompanied her to the exit, and no one needed to. The news had been delivered by a young human resources assistant who refused to look Catherine in the eye, speaking in a low, apologetic murmur as if she were personally responsible for a decision she had merely been handed. Catherine understood the script before the girl could even finish her sentence. She simply nodded, murmured a polite thank you, folded the termination notice into 4 neat, identical squares, and tucked it into her purse alongside her monthly transit pass, an item that had suddenly lost its purpose. Outside, the early southern morning remained warm and utterly indifferent. Catherine took a long, deep breath. She did not breathe to cry, but rather to keep herself from crying. At 29 years old, life had already taught her that tears shed in the wrong place were easily mistaken for weakness by those who didn't deserve to see them. She straightened her spine, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the bus stop with the hurried stride of someone who still had a very important place to go. Inside the bus, she pressed her forehead against the cool window pane and watched the cobblestone streets of Savannah slip past. Her mind immediately began running numbers. The rent on her modest cottage was due in exactly 12 days, and her refrigerator held little more than a carton of eggs, a block of cheddar, and half a melon. She performed this mental inventory with a clinical coldness that sometimes frightened her. It felt as though she were calculating the survival of a stranger, but it was her life, and it had always been hers alone to manage. She had no siblings. Her parents had passed away years ago, and whatever distant relatives she had left could be summed up in an occasional, brief holiday card. Perhaps that was why the home of her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Iris Bennett, had become the only sanctuary in the entire world where Catherine could walk through the front door without knocking, confident that someone was waiting for her on the other side. She stepped off the bus 2 stops early, wanting to walk the remaining blocks so the humid Georgia breeze could clear her mind. Her neighborhood was quiet, filled with modest, historic cottages where the wooden fences were low, and the neighbors still knew the names of each other's pets. Her rented home was separated from Iris's cottage only by a thick privet hedge, which the elderly woman trimmed with a pair of oversized shears and the infinite patience of someone who owned the entire day. And there Iris was, right on cue, sitting in her wicker rocking chair on the porch, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose and a cotton dishcloth draped over her lap. She was watching the quiet street, like someone waiting for a traveler who had forgotten to call ahead. When she spotted Catherine, her face wrinkled into a wide, bright smile that warmed her eyes. "Well, look at you, Catherine. You're home early today, sweetheart," Iris called out, waving a frail hand. "Come on up and have some coffee. I just brewed a fresh pot, nice and strong, just the way you like it." Catherine paused by the low wooden gate. For a fleeting second, she considered inventing an excuse about being tired, wanting nothing more than to crawl into bed and hide from the world. But the truth was, she dreaded the silence of her own empty house. Iris was offering exactly what she needed: a well-worn chair, a warm mug, and a presence that demanded no difficult explanations. "Aren't you worried you'll spoil me with all this coffee, Iris?" Catherine asked, offering a soft smile as she walked up the wooden steps. "Spoil you? Nonsense, child," Iris replied, her rocking chair slowing to a gentle halt. "Coffee shared always tastes sweeter than coffee drunk alone. Everybody knows that, though you're too stubborn to admit it. Get on inside before it gets cold." The kitchen was small and constantly smelled of sweet cornmeal and chicory. It featured a faded yellow laminate countertop, a vintage white stove with chipped enamel on the left corner, and a heavy wooden pendulum clock on the wall that lost 5 minutes every single day. Iris had promised to get that clock fixed ever since her husband, Arthur, had passed away 8 years ago. Yet, she never actually touched it. To adjust the hands would mean admitting that time continued to march forward, even without Arthur there to wind it. Catherine sat down at the table, which was covered in a floral oilcloth, while Iris carefully poured the dark coffee into a thermal carafe and set down a small plate of warm, freshly baked biscuits. "Eat up," Iris insisted, gently patting Catherine's hand. "You've been looking far too thin lately." Catherine split a biscuit in half, watching the steam rise, and felt a sudden sharp ache in her chest. It meant everything to know there's still someone in the world who noticed whether she was eating enough. She ate slowly, listening to Iris chat about the small, quiet happenings of the neighborhood. The stray cat that had taken to sleeping on the garden wall, the summer storm that threatened to break but never did. Catherine replied in soft, comfortable murmurs, letting the gentle tide of the older woman's voice wash over her like a comforting breeze. Suddenly, Iris paused. She looked at Catherine with the deep, searching gaze of someone who could see right through a brave face. "Did something happen today, my dear?" Iris asked softly. Catherine looked up, genuinely surprised that her mask had slipped. "No, Iris. Just a long, tiring day at the office." Iris didn't press her. She simply nodded, stirred her coffee with a small silver spoon, and gently guided the conversation back to the garden. In that quiet decision to respect her boundaries, Catherine felt a profound wave of gratitude. Iris had a rare gift. She noticed everything, yet she invaded nothing. Over the past year, the two women had built a quiet sanctuary of mutual care, based entirely on what went unsaid. They knew when the other was carrying a heavy heart, and instead of asking questions, they simply drew closer, brewed another cup, and found small reasons to stay a little longer. Their quiet friendship had begun nearly a year ago, shortly after Catherine had moved into the neighborhood. She had been entirely alone, unloading heavy cardboard boxes from a rented moving truck in the fading afternoon light. The very next morning, Iris had appeared at her front gate, holding a warm plate covered by a clean gingham napkin. "I made far too much southern squash casserole, and keeping leftovers only sour a kitchen," Iris had said, pressing the warm dish into Catherine's hands and retreating back to her porch before Catherine could even think to decline. It was Catherine's first lesson in neighborhood hospitality. You don't argue with a kind gesture, you simply accept it. A week later, Catherine returned the favor with a basket of fresh peaches and a bundle of wildflowers from the market. From that point on, neither woman could quite remember who had started looking after whom. What Catherine did not know, and what Iris rarely spoke of out of a quiet maternal pride, was that the modest wooden cottage they shared coffee in had been purchased entirely by Iris's son, a man who earned more in a single afternoon than the entire neighborhood earned in a year. Iris had raised her son practically on her own after Arthur's early passing, taking in laundry, sewing wedding dresses, and baking pies to sell at the local school, pinching every single penny until it practically begged for mercy. Her sacrifice had borne fruit. Her boy had studied hard, earned scholarships, built a consulting firm, bought out competitors, and eventually became a name printed in glossy business magazines that Iris didn't care to read. Iris was incredibly proud of him, a pride that swelled in her throat whenever she spoke his name, but she never let it turn into boasting. She had flatly refused his offers of a luxury penthouse in Atlanta, paid vacations to Europe, or a live-in companion to keep her company. "Company is found on the front porch, son," Iris had told him over the phone. "The things I actually want can't be bought with a checkbook." What she wanted, of course, was his time. She wanted his presence. A full, uninterrupted Sunday afternoon, where his sleek smartphone didn't ring every 10 minutes to call him back to a board meeting. He called her, she couldn't deny that. He called every Thursday evening, and the conversation lasted exactly as long as it took for a secretary or an assistant to interrupt him on the other line. He sent generous monthly checks that she quietly deposited into a savings account she never touched. He sent expensive gifts that remained in their cardboard boxes in the closet, and he sent holiday wishes through his personal assistants when he was too busy to write them himself. Iris accepted it all with the same quiet patience she applied to her garden, understanding that her son loved her the only way he knew how, by providing, resolving, and purchasing solutions to problems that money could never actually solve. She harbored no bitterness, only a quiet, polite longing. Far away in his sleek, glass-walled office in Atlanta, the man behind that longing lived in a world that had absolutely nothing to do with slow-dripped coffee and grandfather clocks. Ethan Bennett spent his days high above the city, surrounded by glowing monitors, displaying financial projections that rose and fell. He treated the people around him much like those numbers, useful as long as they yielded a return. Earlier that very week, without a second thought, Ethan had signed his name at the bottom of a restructuring list that his executive board had slid across his desk. It was a document containing dozens of names of employees who, to him, were simply redundant overhead. He hadn't read a single one of those names. He wouldn't have recognized them if he had. To Ethan, an employee was a function, not a human being. As long as the quarterly projections remained in blue, the human cost was merely a necessary adjustment. Just that morning, a young administrative assistant had paused by the doorway of his office, her voice trembling slightly as she asked for a few unpaid days off to care for her ailing father. Ethan had barely looked up from his screen before telling her to coordinate the request with human resources. He hadn't asked her father's name, nor had he asked what was wrong. If someone had tried to tell him that a dismissed employee had a sick parent, a young child, or a mortgage to pay, he would have replied, without anger but with absolute coldness, that a corporation was not an extension of anyone's home. He lived by the firm belief that business and emotion must never mix, and he held himself to that standard, with the same unforgiving rigor he expected from everyone else. He signed the document, handed it back to his chief operating officer, and immediately moved on to the next agenda item. And one of the names neatly crossed out on that printed sheet belonged to a young woman who, at that very moment, was sitting in his mother's kitchen on the coast, sharing a quiet breakfast with the woman who had given him life, without either of them having the slightest clue of their connection. Later that afternoon, after Catherine had left with a gentle hug and a promise to return the next day, Iris sat alone on her porch, slowly rocking in the warm, humid air. She watched Catherine's slender figure walk down the street, noting the way the girl's shoulders tried desperately to remain straight, but kept wanting to slump under an invisible weight. Iris understood the chasm between mere weariness and a heart weighed down by sorrow, yet she refrained from prying. She would wait. Waiting, life had taught her, was the one skill she possessed with an absolute, unfaltering grace. She had waited for a husband who never returned from the hospital. She had waited for a son too consumed by his own life to visit. And now she harbored a quiet hope that this sweet, unassuming girl would one day find someone to cherish her, just as she had always cherished others. Across the hedge, Catherine unlocked her front door, flicked on the kitchen light, and stood before her empty refrigerator, its door still closed. From her purse, she retrieved the folded paper, smoothing it flat on the table with her palm. The stark, corporate prose, already etched into her memory, offered no solace, no loophole, no escape. Tomorrow, the grueling marathon of applications, resume updates, and relentless door-knocking would begin. But today, the hunter had no energy left for the chase. Today, all she possessed was the faint, lingering taste of warm biscuits and the silent reassurance that should her world crumble, the elderly woman next door would notice her kitchen light extinguished before its usual time. The next morning, that woman would appear at her gate, a plate of comfort in hand. She could never have fathomed that the delicate tendril of friendship, nurtured over countless cups of coffee and shared meals, was about to pull her into a narrative far grander than her own. The ensuing 2 weeks dragged by with the leaden, agonizing slowness of a job search that yielded absolutely nothing. Catherine woke each morning from habit, though there was nowhere to go. She meticulously polished her resume, fired off dozens of online applications into the void of corporate black holes, and knocked on the doors of local businesses, only to be met with polite, hollow promises of future consideration. Yet, every afternoon, the suffocating weight of her anxiety would miraculously lift the moment she crossed the garden path to Iris's porch. She'd arrive with a loaf from the corner bakery, a ripe mango, or simply her presence. Iris greeted her with the same unflagging delight each time, as if each visit were a treasured, unexpected gift. Catherine never spoke of her lost job, and Iris never inquired, but the older woman subtly began to make their afternoon snacks more substantial. She would send Catherine home with small containers of leftovers, insisting she had cooked far too much and abhorred waste. Catherine accepted them with grace, playing along with the gentle charade, both of them silently acknowledging who was truly sustaining whom. Then, one warm Tuesday morning, the quiet rhythm of their days was shattered. Iris rose too quickly from her rocking chair, the porch seeming to spin violently around her. She clutched the wooden railing, fighting to remain upright. It wasn't a dire medical crisis, merely a sudden drop in blood pressure, coupled with the chilling realization of what it meant to be old and utterly alone in a silent house. A neighbor across the street, Mrs. Gable, glimpsed her unsteady sway through her window, rushed over to help, and in the heart of the ensuing panic, did the one thing Iris had always implored her neighbors to avoid. She seized the old address book by the kitchen phone, located Ethan's private number, and dialed. In his high-rise Atlanta office, Ethan Bennett answered the unfamiliar call with an irritated frown, only to hear a breathless, frantic voice deliver the news that his mother had collapsed. Deep within him, something ancient and buried beneath decades of spreadsheets and corporate takeovers jolted awake. He canceled 3 crucial client meetings, sprinted to the parking garage, and drove toward Savannah with a reckless urgency he hadn't felt in years. He arrived at the cottage in the late afternoon. The house of his childhood, a place he had diligently tried to supplant with modern luxuries, still held the comforting scent of lavender, old books, and chicory. His mother was resting in her armchair, a cool, damp cloth pressed to her forehead, appearing far more embarrassed by the fuss she had caused than shaken by her dizzy spell. Ethan knelt before her, his hands clasped around her frail ones, bombarding her with frantic questions about doctors, medication, and diet, desperately trying to conceal the tremor in his own hands. Iris looked at her son, his expensive suit creased from the long drive, and offered a soft, watery smile. "You actually came," she whispered. The sheer simplicity of those words pierced Ethan more deeply than any reprimand could have. "Of course I came, Mom," he said, clearing his throat. He yearned to summon specialists, arrange for private nurses, and solve the problem with the effortless efficiency his wealth afforded. But Iris, with her characteristic quiet stubbornness, refused. It was just a brief spell, she insisted. All she truly needed was a little rest, and for him to sit with her for a while in the quiet house that had felt so empty for far too long. Ethan agreed to stay the night, more to assuage his own gnawing anxiety than to comprehend what his mother genuinely needed. He settled onto the old sofa, loosened his tie, and for the first time in years, truly observed the details of the room. He noticed his father's old silver watch on the shelf, the handmade lace adorning the armchair, and a small, empty plate on the table, bearing a few lingering crumbs from a shared afternoon snack. He didn't ask who had been there. utterly unaware that the answer was about to walk through the front door. On the other side of the privet hedge, Catherine spotted the sleek, expensive black SUV parked in front of Iris's gate and felt a sudden, unwelcome knot of worry tighten in her chest. It was the hour she usually arrived for their afternoon coffee, and the sight of an unfamiliar vehicle made her hesitate. She didn't want to intrude on a family visit, but Iris hadn't appeared on the porch for 2 days, and her concern for her friend trumped her reticence. Clutching a small bag of fresh pastries, she ascended the creaking wooden steps and gently knocked, expecting to hear Iris's warm voice inviting her in. Instead, the door swung open to reveal a tall man in a crisp white shirt, his collar unbuttoned, his face etched with the weariness of the road, and his dark eyes holding the cold, commanding air of someone accustomed to issuing orders. Catherine recognized him instantly. He, of course, did not recognize her. She had seen him stride through the lobby of her former firm without a glance at any employee, stepping into his private elevator, bypassing his staff's desks as if they were mere office partitions. He was the owner. He was the name emblazoned at the top of the corporate letterhead, the signature at the bottom of her termination notice, the face she associated with the darkest day of her professional life. And here he was, standing in Iris Bennett's doorway, regarding her with the polite impatience of a busy man interrupted by a stranger. "Yes, can I help you?" Ethan asked, his voice smooth and entirely professional. Catherine felt a flush creep up her neck. The small bag of pastries suddenly felt as heavy as lead in her hands. For a fleeting second, she longed to turn and flee, to apologize for knocking on the wrong door, and retreat to her cottage before he could grasp the bizarre connection between them. But her pride rebelled against such a retreat. She straightened her back and met his gaze directly. "I came to see Iris," Catherine stated, her voice remarkably steady. "I'm her neighbor. Is she all right?" Ethan's eyes narrowed, quietly assessing the young woman in the simple cotton shirt and denim. There was something in the way she held his gaze, devoid of the deference or intimidation he typically encountered, that unsettled him. "My mother had a brief spell, but she's resting now," Ethan replied coolly. "Thank you for stopping by." He began to close the door in a practiced, dismissive motion. But from the living room, Iris's voice called out, weak but sharp. "Ethan, who is that? Is that Catherine? Let her in, for heaven's sake. Catherine, come inside, dear." The name struck Ethan like a sudden splash of cold water. Catherine, he knew that name. Not from his personal life, but from a printed sheet of paper he had signed without reading, just 2 weeks prior. The two worlds he meticulously kept separate, the realm of bottom lines and the quiet sanctuary of his mother's cottage, had collided on the threshold of this old wooden door, and he had absolutely no idea how to navigate the intersection. He looked at her again, truly seeing her this time, a sudden sinking feeling dawning as he realized this was a real person whose life he had irrevocably altered with the stroke of his pen. "Do you two know each other?" Ethan asked, his gaze shifting between Catherine and his mother, his voice losing its corporate polish. "Know her?" Iris scoffed gently from her chair. "This girl is the only soul in this neighborhood who cares whether I eat or sleep. Come in, Catherine. Don't mind my son. He has no idea how to welcome guests." Catherine didn't step forward immediately. She held his gaze for another long moment, a silent, weighty question hanging in the air between them. Did he know? She saw the sudden realization dawn in his eyes, the subtle shift from irritation to quiet shock. He knew, but she decided then and there that she would not grant him the satisfaction of seeing her diminished, nor would she allow him to transform this into a corporate apology. She lifted her chin, walked past him into the warm living room, and placed the pastries on the table. She adjusted the cushion behind Iris's back and inquired about her medicine with the comfortable familiarity of someone who belonged there. Ethan watched from the doorway, feeling utterly out of place in the home he funded. When his mother asked him to fetch a glass of water, he walked into the kitchen and realized He didn't even know where the glasses were kept. Second cabinet, bottom shelf, Catherine said quietly from the living room, her voice devoid of malice or sarcasm, stating it simply as a fact. The fact stung. She knew his mother's kitchen better than he did. Ethan returned with the glass, his knuckles white around the cold surface. "Have you been helping her long?" he asked, his tone still carrying a trace of defensive authority. "Every day," Catherine replied, meeting his gaze directly. "For almost a year. And where was I during that year, Ethan?" Iris added, her voice gentle but cutting. The ensuing silence was deafening. Ethan had no answer. He swallowed his pride and steered the conversation back to the doctor's instructions, but the tension in the room remained thick and heavy. As evening approached, Catherine politely declined an offer to stay for dinner. She bid Iris goodbye with a warm hug and dismissed Ethan with a polite, chilly nod that felt like a slap to his ego. He stood by the window, watching her cross the narrow garden path back to her cottage. Only then did the full weight of reality settle in his chest. This woman wasn't just a casual acquaintance. She was an integral, vital part of his mother's life, and he, who prided himself on managing vast corporate networks, didn't even know the name of the woman living a mere 10 feet from his mother's porch. Ethan woke early the next morning in his old childhood bedroom, his back aching from the unfamiliar softness of the mattress, his mind a whirl. He had decided, against every business instinct he possessed, to remain through the weekend. He told himself it was out of concern for his mother's health, but deep down, he was consumed by a quiet, restless curiosity about the neighbor who had met his gaze with such fierce intensity. Precisely at 9 o'clock, the front gate clicked open. Catherine walked up the steps, carrying a fresh loaf of bread and a container of sliced fruit. She greeted Iris warmly, offered Ethan a brief nod, and proceeded to tidy the kitchen with practiced ease. Her complete indifference to his status was infuriating to a man accustomed to being the gravitational center of every room he entered. It was Iris who shattered the tense silence, her gaze fixed on Catherine with a mother's worry. "You must eat more of this bread, Catherine. You've grown far too thin. This is hardly the time to be skipping meals." She then turned to Ethan, her voice softening. "The poor girl lost her job 2 weeks ago, Ethan. A big firm downtown simply let her go, no second thoughts whatsoever." Catherine froze, her butter knife hovering midair, a flush of embarrassment heating her cheeks. She shot Iris a look, a silent plea for her to stop, but the older woman had already returned to her tea. Ethan, however, felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "Which firm?" he asked, his voice low. Catherine met his gaze, her eyes alight with a mixture of pride and indignation. "Yours, Mr. Bennett," she stated clearly. "Hughes Consulting. I was part of the administrative team on the 3rd floor, until your signature deemed me no longer necessary." The ensuing silence was suffocating. Ethan sat rigid, his tea growing cold in his hand. For the first time in his career, the human cost of a spreadsheet had a name, a face, and was standing in his mother's kitchen. He rose, needing air, and stepped out onto the wooden porch. A few minutes later, as Catherine walked out to leave, Ethan moved to block her path. He had spent the last hour mentally constructing a standard corporate solution, the kind of clean, financial resolution that always worked in his world. "Catherine, please, wait," Ethan began, his voice hesitant. "About what my mother said. I didn't personally create those lists. There are committees, managers, metrics. But my name is on the door. I want to make this right. I can arrange a severance package, or find you a position within our network. Just name your price." Catherine regarded him, her expression shifting from anger to a profound, weary sadness. "Do you honestly believe everything can be settled with a number, Ethan?" "I'm trying to rectify an injustice," he insisted, his tone sincere but clumsy. "No, you're trying to buy yourself a clear conscience," Catherine retorted, her voice low and sharp. "There's a difference. Even if you offered me my old job back today, I would never accept it. I have no desire to work for a man who erases lives on paper without ever meeting their eyes. And frankly, you shouldn't be concerned with my bank account. You should be worried about the woman inside that house who waits every single day for a son who only appears when she's collapsed. That's the account you're truly behind on, Mr. Bennett, not mine. She descended the steps, leaving him standing on the porch with his hollow offer hanging in the warm Georgia air. He remained there for a long time, watching the sun dip below the horizon, her words echoing in his ears. When he finally returned inside, he began to notice the quiet, unseen details of the house that his wealth had never afforded him. On the refrigerator, a handwritten note from Catherine outlined his mother's medication schedule. In the bathroom, a sturdy metal grab bar had been professionally installed near the tub. He knew, without asking, that he hadn't paid for it. Every corner of the cottage bore the imprints of a daily, unpaid, loving devotion that no bank transfer could ever replicate. That evening, as he shared a simple dinner with his mother, Iris looked at him with a tender, serious expression. "Do you know what I love most about Catherine, son? She never looks at me with pity. She sits with me, she argues with me, she laughs with me, and then she returns the next day. Some people give you everything, yet offer you nothing, and some people have nothing, yet they give you the most precious thing in the world, their time." And Ethan spent the following weeks divided between his corporate office in Atlanta and his mother's cottage in Savannah. He began traveling down every single weekend, delegating tasks he once insisted on micromanaging. The transition was awkward at first, but slowly, a fragile truce began to form between him and Catherine. One Saturday afternoon, a sudden summer downpour revealed a leak in Iris's porch roof. Ethan, clad in a damp linen shirt, precariously balanced on a wooden ladder, struggling with a loose shingle he had absolutely no idea how to fix. Catherine stood below, holding the ladder steady, observing his clumsy efforts with an amused smile. "Get down before you break your neck, city boy," she teased. "Let someone who actually knows how to use her hands do it." She then climbed up, adjusted the slate in 2 swift motions, and descended with soot on her fingers and a genuine laugh on her lips. It was the first time she had smiled at him, and Ethan found himself laughing along, a warm, rusty sound he hadn't heard from himself in years. Later that evening, as a storm rattled the windows, the 3 of them sat around the kitchen table, sharing a pot of chamomile tea. Under the soft glow of the kitchen light, Iris began to speak of the past. She recounted the arduous years after Ethan's father passed, of working late into the night sewing dresses, and of the day a 15-year-old Ethan had come home, sat at this very table, and announced he'd secured a job as an office runner so she wouldn't have to work so hard. "He was only 15, Iris murmured, her hand gently resting on Ethan's, carrying the weight of the world on his young shoulders. "I wanted him to simply be a boy, but hunger makes men out of boys very quickly." Ethan looked down at his teacup, his voice quiet as he shared a memory he had never confided in anyone. "I remember the day of Dad's funeral," he whispered. "We had so little. I made a promise to myself that day that we would never again be at the mercy of poverty. I wanted to build a wall of money so high that nothing could ever hurt us. I built the wall, Catherine, but somewhere along the way, I forgot that walls keep people out too. I thought caring was a liability." Catherine looked at the powerful executive seated across from her and, for the first time, saw the wounded boy beneath the armor. She realized his coldness wasn't born of malice, but of a deep, ancient fear of vulnerability. Without a word, she reached across the table and placed her hand over theirs. The seasons turned, and the humid summer yielded to a crisp, golden Georgia autumn. The weekends in Savannah had transformed Ethan. He spent his days sitting on the porch with his mother, learning to listen without glancing at his watch, and assisting Catherine with carrying groceries from the local market. He found himself falling deeply in love with the headstrong, independent woman who had refused to let him buy her respect. Back in Atlanta, his corporate world began to reflect his internal shift. He convened a meeting with his executive board, demanded a comprehensive review of the recent layoffs, and personally worked to reinstate several positions, implementing a new corporate policy that prioritized employee retention and family leave. But his heart remained in Savannah. One afternoon, after learning from Iris that Catherine was struggling to pay her rent, Ethan quietly settled her landlord's payments for the entire year ahead. He believed it was a gesture of pure love, but he failed to grasp that for a woman who had fought for her independence every single day of her life, an unsolicited financial rescue felt like an act of patronizing pity. When Catherine discovered what he had done, she confronted him in his mother's kitchen, her eyes blazing with a mixture of betrayal and pride. "Who gave you the right to manage my life, Ethan? Do you think I'm just another project for you to resolve so you can feel like a good person? If you see me as a charity case, then we have nothing left to discuss." Ethan returned to Atlanta that night, with a crushing weight in his chest. His mother's words resonated in his mind. "Catherine doesn't need you to save her, Ethan. She needs you to believe she is strong enough to save herself. Wealth cannot buy partnership." For 2 long weeks, Catherine refused his calls. She returned every penny of the rent money to her landlord, working double shifts at a local boutique to secure her own home. Yet, in the quiet evenings, as she gazed out at the darkened cottage next door, she felt a profound, aching silence. She missed his laughter, his clumsy attempts to help, and the quiet warmth of his presence. The silence was shattered on a cold Tuesday winter night. Catherine's frantic call jolted Ethan awake in Atlanta at 3 o'clock in the morning. Iris had suffered a severe stroke. Ethan drove through the dark Georgia night like a man possessed, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he offered a desperate, silent prayer for more time. When he burst through the hospital doors in Savannah, he found Catherine waiting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway, her face pale and her eyes swollen from crying. The moment she saw him, all pride and anger dissolved. She ran into his arms, and he held her tightly, the two of them weeping together in the quiet corridor. "She's stable, Ethan," Catherine whispered against his shoulder, "but the doctors say the next 48 hours are critical. She kept asking for you." For the next 3 days, Ethan did not leave his mother's bedside. He slept in a plastic chair, helped her sip water, and held her hand as her speech slowly began to return. Catherine remained by his side, sharing meals from the hospital cafeteria and engaging in quiet conversations in the dim light of the recovery room. One evening, as Iris slept peacefully, Ethan turned to Catherine. "I'm stepping down as active CEO," he said softly. "I've appointed a trusted partner to manage daily operations in Atlanta. I'm moving back to Savannah permanently. I want to build a life here, near my mother, and if you'll have me, Catherine, I want to build a life with you, not to save you, and not to manage you, but to walk beside you as an equal." Catherine gazed at the man who had shed his armor, offering her nothing but his honest, vulnerable heart. She smiled, her eyes tearing up, and pulled him into a deep, long-awaited kiss. Iris made a slow, miraculous recovery, returning to her beloved cottage just in time for the spring blooms. The cottage was no longer quiet. Catherine moved her sewing business into the front room, her custom dress designs quickly becoming the talk of Savannah's historic district, entirely funded by her own hard work. They were married on a warm afternoon in Iris's backyard, beneath the shade of a massive live oak draped in Spanish moss. There were no corporate sponsors, no grand displays of wealth, just a table laden with hand-embroidered linens, a fresh pot of chicory coffee, and the laughter of the neighbors who had witnessed their story unfold. Iris stood proudly by the porch, leaning on her cane, tears of pure joy tracing paths down her weathered cheeks. She raised her coffee mug to the newlyweds, her voice steady and clear in the warm afternoon breeze. "My beautiful children," she smiled, "never forget that a cup of coffee shared will always carry you further than the greatest fortune hoarded for yourself." In the twilight of our lives, when the frantic noise of the world begins to fade and the grand structures we spent our youth building reveal themselves as nothing more than temporary scaffolding, a quiet and profound truth begins to settle in the heart. We spend the better part of our strength chasing security, convincing ourselves that if we can only gather enough resources, build high enough walls, or secure enough titles, we will finally be safe from the vulnerabilities of being human. We mistake the accumulation of things for the cultivation of a life, but the old, who have watched the seasons turn and the years slip away like sand through worn fingers, know that the only currency that retains its value at the end of the day is the love we gave and the presence we offered to those who walked the road with us. True wealth is never measured by what we can write a check for, but by the quiet, daily devotions that money can neither command nor replicate. It is found in the patience to linger on a porch, absorbing a tale heard a dozen times, in the grace of showing up even when there's nothing to be gained, and in the quiet humility that recognizes every soul we encounter carries within them a universe of dignity, sorrow, and hope. When we reduce the world to a mere transaction, we shrink our own lives into a sterile ledger, transforming the vibrant, chaotic comedy of human connection into a stark balance of profits and losses. Yet, when we dare to descend from our lofty perches, when we permit ourselves to be seen in our vulnerability and our longing, we discover that the most sacred spaces are invariably the simplest. A hushed kitchen, a shared loaf of bread, a hand to clasp as the night deepens. For those of us who have journeyed through this world long enough to witness paint fade and gardens reclaim their wildness, we grasp that time is the sole truly non-renewable treasure. We can never reclaim a single yesterday, nor can we guarantee a single tomorrow. All that is bestowed upon us is the delicate, exquisite present and the power to choose its contents. Let us fill it with the courage to be open, the fortitude to honor the autonomy of those we cherish, and the discernment to understand that the most profound gift we can bestow upon another is not our shield, but our presence. Ultimately, as the grandfather clock of our existence tolls its final chime, we will not recall the figures on our balance sheets or the victories claimed in the grand stadiums of our ambitions. We will remember the gentle warmth of a hand in the darkness, the shared mirth over a simple repast, and the quiet solace of knowing we did not traverse the long, meandering path home entirely alone.